almost exactly 6 years ago, we heard him not running for the presidency and going to the sunset of his years. So it's actually, you better bet on this guy not saying the truth, right? Or, I mean, as far as Duterte is concerned, he's a consummate Machiavellian. He's going to always try to assess the balance of forces on the ground, and sometimes at the 11th hour or past it, he's going to make a decision to protect his interests. I mean, after all, President Duterte has clear motivations to stay in power in one way or another, right? The International Criminal Court has opened investigation into his war on drugs. The Philippines is a very hostile country, perhaps the second most hostile after South Korea to ex-presidents. All three previous presidents faced one form of political persecution, if not actual prosecution or the other. Duterte is looking at that, and it's not looking very good for him. So he has all the motivations to stay. There are also concerns about the independence of the Philippines Commission on Elections, on the integrity of the election process, among other things. But the reality is that I would argue that the tide is shifting against him. I mean, the reality is that presidential elections in the Philippines tend to be an anti-incumbent. And yes, Duterte may be popular, but let's not forget, these surveys are conducted in a climate of fear. These surveys are not conducted in my neighborhoods or upper middle class or rich Filipino neighborhoods. They're conducted in neighborhoods that tend to be also host to extrajudicial killings, to many people who are dependent on government assistance amid the pandemic. So yes, he is popular, but I take some of these numbers with a grain of salt. But even if you take those numbers, he had a 21-point decline since last year, November, right? So the trajectory is not very good for him. More than 50% of people from his home island of Mindanao said, please don't run for vice president. 60% in the Philippines said the same thing. His numbers in the latest surveys, he's now a distant second for the vice presidency, 11 points behind the Senate president. His daughter saw an 8-point decline and now statistically tied with Marcos and the charismatic mayor of Manila, not to mention Manny Pacquiao not far away. So I think the tide is shifting against Duterte, and he recognizes that they may pull off a substitution move next month. Actually, if you look at the rules, it's much more flexible. It also depends how the COMELEC will determine it. In fact, there used to be a rule that until the midday of elections, you can replace another candidate if you have the same family name. So we cannot say even by November what will be his move. But the reality is that on the ground, things are shifting against him. And it's in fact Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos, who's trying to consolidate the vote on the right. So the other candidates are trying to occupy the center. In the case of Leni Robredo, the vice president, she is positioning herself as a true opposition. This is an extremely fluid situation and can cut both ways. And as far as Duterte is concerned, perhaps his best bet is to have the Marcoses win in the upcoming election. So maybe we got the Duterte and complained a lot, but over the horizon, another Marcos could win. But at the same time, the centrist candidates and opposition have a lot to work with. Strings of corruption scandals have hit the government. The Philippines has had one of the deepest economic recessions on earth. It has had one of the highest infection rates for COVID-19 in the region. So as far as material is concerned, the opposition and centrist candidates can really work on that. But the question is, can they unify? One thing that is troubling me is this infighting among supposedly opposition candidates. Leni Robredo camp versus Manila Mayor Isko Moreno camp. This is not looking good. So I think if the opposition and centrist candidate continue their infighting, they're going to give this on a silver platter to the scion of the former dictator, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr.